Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do appreciate the tone, the respectful tone, the way in which all members in this place are approaching an issue which I know could divide us, but which, touching on the sanctity of life, touching on issues of great importance to all of us, and on the question of human suffering that so distresses all of us, and interpreting a Supreme Court decision, this is a bill, Bill C-14, that requires a sobriety, a sensitivity, and a respectful dialogue as we approach it. Other members have reflected on what they've learned from their constituents, and I need to, I think, share a story of what happened to me when I became the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands. I was someone who wouldn't have been comfortable with this bill. And my constituents may be one of the most active group of people in working for Dying with Dignity. There are 2 Dying with Dignity chapters within Saanich Gulf Islands. I was visited by members from the Salt Spring Island chapter. I was visited by members from the Victoria chapter. And over time, I realized that perhaps my riding had been sensitized to this issue because Sue Rodriguez lived in my riding. And her death in 1994 touched, I think, all Canadians, as we realized that she tried so hard to get relief from the courts and permission to have a medically assisted death, which in the end was not possible through a legal system, and we all remember her quite courageous and tragic death. At the time of the court telling Sue Rodriguez that she could not find access to legal medically assisted death, she said this, quote, "If I cannot consent to my own death, whose body is this? Who owns my life?" These are profound questions that hang in the air still. Some of us might answer, well, none of us own our own life. Our life belongs to the Creator. Some of us may say, well, whatever you believe, each of us has the right to make our own decisions. And those people who might believe one aspect through faith have no right to deny someone else the decision that they want to take to plan for a death with dignity. So in the course of listening to my constituents, particularly through a series of town hall meetings over the last 5 years, through questions and comments that have come to me through the mail, I became persuaded that my job as their Member of Parliament is to support access to medically assisted death. Then my life experience as a lawyer kicked in, and I was very relieved when the Carter decision came down. I thought, at long last, we now have legal clarity on this matter, and the Parliament can begin to resolve the issue through the courts. I'd rather not through the courts, through the work here in Parliament. The issue has been through the courts so often that I felt that we were now in a position as lawmakers and legislators to deal with the decision in Carter. So just to remind us, the Supreme Court said that the criminal code sections that prohibited physician-assisted death violate Section 7 of the Charter and therefore, quote, are void insofar as they prohibit physician-assisted death for a competent adult person who, 1, clearly consents to the termination of life, and 2, has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, brackets, including an illness, disease, or disability, bracket close, that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. So the court was clear in this decision that we were not speaking of any possibility that one person could make a decision for medical assistance in dying for anyone else. This is a personal decision. The Supreme Court has said for a competent adult person can make this determination. And what the court set out as the conditions that would justify medically assisted death, grievous and irremediable medical condition. Now, I was disappointed in C-14. I felt after looking at the report of the special committee that the legislation would likely anticipate where the court would go in future rulings and avoid protracted court cases as Canada figures out how we accommodate medical assistance in dying. I believe this bill, in not fulfilling even the conditions set out in the Carter decision of the Supreme Court, will lead to more litigation, more suffering for people who now see that the Supreme Court of Canada has said that to suffer in situations like this violate their charter rights. And yet this Parliament, if we pass C-14 as it's currently drafted, will be denying them their charter rights going forward. So let me just take a moment, and other members of Parliament have mentioned this. We know that this legislation is attempting to balance very difficult issues to ensure that there are robust safeguards. We've had conversations as whether they are sufficiently robust, the sanctity of life, the protection of vulnerable persons. And I think this bill is close to getting it right. But where I'm really baffled is in the decision not just to say irremediable, but to insist, as others have noted, that one of the conditions in Section 241.2, subsection 2, is that under sub D, their natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. Now that's, I'm afraid, quite baffling given what the Supreme Court told us we must do. The irremediable situation was not described as incurable nor terminal. That, I think, is a deficiency in this legislation, and one that will not just disappoint, but I think not just disappoint people who are suffering, but I think call into question the wisdom of this place in interpreting the Supreme Court of Canada's decision to protect charter rights. The second area, and many have spoken to this as well, whereas I read it, I thought, well, this can't be right. This must just be bad drafting. They can't mean this. That in going through all the conditions, and yes, there are safeguards here, that you have independent medical practitioners, more than one, that there not be undue influence of any kind. So you go through, not to go through every element of it, but a quite protracted process to make a legal declaration, and that you have that fulfilled by independent witnesses, and you've gone through all of this, and then after all that, at 241 sub 2, sub 3, sub H, we find this, that immediately before providing the medical assistance in dying, give the person an opportunity to withdraw their request and ensure that the person gives express consent to receive medical assistance in dying. Well, this, Mr. Speaker, is gravely disappointing. The person who takes the decision that they want medical assistance in dying is now denied that if their situation is one where we can't reasonably foresee their natural death, and where, at the moment that they have planned for, gone through this protracted process to ensure that they will have medical assistance in their death, they now must be of sound mind to reassert and have the capacity to reassert that they have confirmed that this is what they wish. This will surely deny many groups of people who would look to the court decision in Carter as their way of knowing that they would have the right to choose that they die with dignity with the assistance of a medical professional. Many have mentioned these deficiencies in C-14. There are others that have been raised by the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. It was a co-litigant in the Carter case, and I'm not out of sympathy with those, but perhaps those could wait for another time. I don't see how Parliament can decide to wait for another time in ensuring that the legislation we pass now is in conformity with the instructions we've received from the Supreme Court of Canada. And currently, Bill C-14 will, in my view, calling on my background as a lawyer, as well as my commitment to my constituents, I look at C-14 and say, how can we pass something that will once again be found by a court to violate Section 7 charter rights for those Canadians who have met the test in Carter, but will fail the test in Bill C-14. So again, it is an enormously difficult question. I have enormous respect for all the voices I've heard in the House in this debate at second reading. I will vote for this bill at second reading, but I will hope that we are prepared to fix its deficiencies in committee.